Sorry, everybody. This is an outline of my presentation. As I said, I'm going to be talking about what prevention is. And the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime has finally given us a very nice, broad definition of prevention that I'm hoping we will be able to use universally, because oftentimes people can't agree on what we mean by prevention. Talking about how prevention science is applied to substance use prevention, and talk about who should be trained in prevention science. And then, as I said, giving you examples. Here is the definition of prevention. This application of prevention science to address the health and safety of individuals through improving socialization processes, and we'll talk more about that, to enhance self-realization and participation in society. So you can see it's a very broad definition, and it shows what the goals are and what the processes are that we're talking about. So defining prevention science, it's very interesting that the history of prevention science is a very short one. The first time I've seen the term prevention science being used was in an article in 1993. And subsequent to that, there has not been a lot written about it. In 2008, 2007, 2008, the United States Society for Prevention Research put together a group to develop a document that would define prevention science to sort of spell out what this field is. So that was the first effort that was made, and at the bottom of the screen you can see the reference, Standards of Knowledge for Science of Prevention for the Society for Prevention Research. Came out in 2011, and you can access that through looking at the website of Society for Prevention Research, or you can email me and I'll be happy to supply that to you. I think what's important in this slide is that prevention science, I guess wait, let's step back a minute. When we were sat down and tried to decide on how we want to define this, we decided to define it. What is it about prevention science that makes it different from sociology, psychology, epidemiology, et cetera? And so that was what guided us coming up with it as a multidisciplinary field, because it draws from all of those fields. And it's a field that examines both behaviors associated with positive and negative health outcomes. And the goal of prevention science, as we say here, is to improve health by looking at vulnerability factors and risk and protective factors and addressing them. Also, the goal of prevention science is to develop effective interventions and to assess them, to evaluate them, and to disseminate them and diffuse them. So that not only do we develop these interventions and test them, we just don't leave them there. We try to get them out to the communities that need them. So the field is pretty broad. It includes human development, social ecology, and identification of factors and processes that lead to positive and negative health behaviors and outcomes. And we see prevention science as a foundation for health education, health promotion, as well as prevention interventions. It draws very heavily on theories of health behavior that are the foundation for health education and health promotion. Prevention science not only includes the research arm, which when we hear the word science, we tend to think that's more of the research end, but it also includes practice. And that's it. When we started out putting this definition together, we wanted to be very inclusive, because we learned from our practitioner colleagues on how we actually disseminate and embed these programs into organizations and into the community. So there's three major components of prevention science. There's epidemiology and etiology, which defines the problem that we're looking at. What is the problem? Who's affected by it? How do you define it? What's the consequences of it? What's the progression, if there's a progression, such as there is with substance use? Also, conduct the research to understand what are the predictors of these problem behaviors, and also understanding the natural history of the problem is really important. So once we know this information, then how do we apply it into an intervention that will impede the progress of, if once it's initiated, if a problem is initiated, or how do we stop it from happening from the beginning. And intervention development is designed for prevention is theory-based. We look at not only etiology theories, that's theories of causation, if you will, but learning theories, because prevention covers a whole lifespan. We are attuned to the fact that our messages we are trying to convey have to reach the target population. So the message that you would deliver to a child would be different than one that you would deliver to even an early adolescent, which would even be different than delivering a message to an older adolescent or to an adult. And also when you talk about adults, we do have prevention programs that span the lifespan, that also learning theories are important. And also theories of behavior change. And I'll be talking a little bit about why those theories are really important. The other aspect that's important is the research methodology that tests the efficacy of prevention interventions and the effectiveness once these interventions are found to be effective in controlled circumstances, such as in randomized controlled trials. Then how do they actually work in the real world? So that research methodology is really important. So those are the major components of prevention science. So why is prevention science important to prevention professionals? In my past, I used to work at the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and I often would talk to practitioner groups, prevention practitioners. And to be honest with you, a lot of the times when they heard that I was a researcher, they would get up and walk out of the room because they didn't see the application. And that was a problem on the researcher's part. We weren't able to convey that knowledge in a useful way. So, but it is important because prevention science gives us the information about who's affected by the behavior so we can target our interventions. Who's vulnerable and what makes them vulnerable, so we can really select interventions that meet the needs of those particular groups. The consequences of these behavior and how those consequences change over time, and how to intervene effectively with individuals or the environments to reduce the risk of initiation of the behaviors that we're concerned about, and certainly the continuation and progression of them. One of the things that I think is important, and this is from a U.S. perspective, we talk a lot about drug use. In one of the trainings we did was with some gentlemen from Afghanistan, and when we were talking about legal, illegal drugs, because that again is a U.S. perspective, and one of the men said, but in our countries, alcohol is illegal. And I'll tell you, a light bulb went off in my head. And I said, of course, we're not really interested in the legality or illegal. We're really interested in the health impacts of these substances. And we're really interested in psychoactive substances. And I think that makes a big difference when we really focus on this classification of substances and talking about substances and not drugs per se. And most of you all probably know this better than I do, that psychoactive substances are those substances that alter our mood, our thoughts, our sensory perceptions, and our behaviors, and how we interact with the world around us. And these substances include alcohol, tobacco, and some prescription medications that are considered legal in the United States, as well as hashish, cannabis, heroin, and a number of other drugs that are considered illegal substances. So we're really focusing on those substances that impact the brain, where addiction begins. In addiction, we talk about the reward circuit, which impacts our natural behaviors, and it's created by the overstimulation of use of psychoactive substances. And then the user begins a pattern of wanting to repeat the euphoric effect of these substances because of how they change the systems in our brains. I just have a couple of slides that just to demonstrate this. This is a slides of imaging, brain imaging for a healthy brain, which is on the left, and comparing it to a brain of a cocaine user. And I don't know if you've seen these slides before. I think the brain imaging was a big boon in our field to demonstrate how these chemicals, these substances actually impact parts of the brain. Once you see these, it's interesting if you show these to children and you teach them about brain, how the brain functions and what parts of the brain are in charge of various thinking and motion, etc. And you show them these slides, they really get it right away. They can say, oh my goodness, that's why the person who is a cocaine user acts the way they do. Or even nicotine affects the brain for a smoker. And for us in prevention, of course, we're very interested in use because we know that the early use of psychoactive substances increases the person's chances of becoming addicted and increases then their vulnerability to physical and social problems and all. So prevention programming is really, really important for the youth. But that does not mean that we shouldn't be concerned of populations who are older. One of the major reasons why we're really concerned about substance use in the brain is because the brain is still developing throughout into our 20s and sometimes I think into our late adulthood also. So if you look at that, if you understand the development of the brain and you begin to see the effects of brain on a child's brain, you can see in this slide, which I think is, I hope it's easy to recognize, but you can see that on one side you have a 15-year-old male non-drinker, and on the right you have a 15-year-old male heavy drinker. So you can see the differences in the parts of the brain that are being impacted. And I think pharmacology is really important for prevention professionals to understand. In many instances, the prevention professional may be the only one in the community who may know about substance use. Is often the go-to person for information about pharmacology of drugs. And it's important for prevention professionals to understand how substances work in the brain, how they produce their effects and where those effects occur, what are the negative consequences of their actions, and then who is vulnerable to abuse and dependence. And understanding this provides a basis for the development of implementations and implementation of effective prevention interventions, and also helps them to advocate for prevention. So what do we know about prevention science? Well, it's a very new field. So it's not only been defined just a few years ago, but the research leading up to the development of prevention science has really a short history relative to other fields. I think the major impact occurred when the National Institute on Drug Abuse was created in 1974, because before that time, most of the research that we had on trying to understand this problem was qualitative research and research that was done in small groups, was poorly funded, and wasn't consistent. We really didn't have a good methodology. So with the creation of in 1974 of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, we began to develop studies to examine factors that were related to the onset of use through epidemiologic studies. Also important was in the 1970s, the theories that I discussed earlier really came about and were written about, and more research was conducted on them, on behavior and learning theories. Another advance was in research and statistical methods. Statistical methods really advanced rapidly during this period of time. I was doing research at the time when I was at Johns Hopkins, and I remember with how important it was when logistic regression programs were made available for us to do our research, and it really had a tremendous impact on advancing our knowledge about the effects of substance use on children as well as on adults. The other amazing, to me, a big impact was in the late 1980s and early 1990s, we began to see prevention success, where we're beginning to get significant outcomes from our prevention interventions. And the first two that I think were breakthroughs because they had such the large impact, but also the studies were so well done and the research was so well done that they were appearing, the results of these studies were appearing in very reputable journals like the Journal of American Medical Association. And I think that gave some more credibility to the field and to field of prevention research. In 1996, in the United States, we had a tremendous increase in marijuana use, and we were very concerned about it. And so the National Institute on Drug Abuse put together the first national conference on drug abuse prevention, and it was set, the format of that conference was to create a dialogue between researchers and practitioners. And the outcome of that was what we call the Red Book. It was preventing drug use among children and adolescents. And in this, we tried to create this little book to capture the research in a way that practitioners could use it and communities could use it. And it was a very popular publication, translated in many different languages around the world. Another big event was the establishment of the U.S. Society for Prevention Research in 1991, and then in 2010, the European Union established a Society for Prevention Research. Since then, Australia and New Zealand are starting not a Society for Prevention Research, but an association that looks at prevention and prevention research, and the Brazilians are starting a society that includes health education as well as prevention research. Two other breakthroughs I think were significant in our field was in 2011, the European Monitoring Center for Drug and Drug Addiction published the European Drug Prevention Quality Standards, and this was the first time a group of people actually sat down and wrote about what the competencies and skills needed to deliver drug prevention programming with quality and with fidelity. And you can see the cover of the book to the right of the screen. This is also available if you go on the European Monitoring Center's website. You can download it. And I would recommend those of you who are interested in the competencies and skills of prevention practitioners that it's a very valuable resource. Excuse me. That was followed in 2013 with the international publication of the International Standards on Drug Prevention, which was a guide that was developed by the UNODC, United Nations Office on Drugs and Crimes. And in that guide is a distillation and compilation of a review of the research literature to identify evidence-based strategies for prevention. And I think I'm going to have a slide later on, but what we did was we were trying to categorize these interventions by age and setting. So it's a very useful instrument. The guide was developed principally for policymakers, and UNODC had a number of regional seminars, I think they're still going on, to introduce policymakers at the ministerial level of countries to understand that there is a science behind prevention and that there's actually evidence-based strategies that can be used in prevention. I think the challenge to all of us in this field is the fact that we're talking about a range of use patterns in any geographic area. And Bill Crano, one of our media prevention researchers, actually began looking at detail. He was particularly interested in non-using populations And what he found is that there are two types of non-users in a population. He principally was looking at adolescents. And what he found are the resolute non-users, those who say they're not going to use and they don't use. And they're vulnerable non-users. Those, I think, are the challenge to prevention, because those, I call them the fence sitters. They could go either way. They say they're not going to use, but maybe they'll use under certain circumstances. So they are very vulnerable. Then there's, of course, those people who start using the substances, but because for a number of reasons they discontinue use. And then there are those who initiate use and then progress to abuse and to substance use disorders. And those, of course, who are already experiencing consequences of their use, health consequences and social consequences. And such a range of substance use patterns requires a range of interventions. And the National Research Council in 1994 put together a book on this issue. And I like this diagram because this is what my dream would be, is for every community to have an array of services that are integrated like this, that go from universal prevention, I'll define that in a little while, all the way through to aftercare, including rehabilitation, after treatment. Prevention is prevention, this is a big debate in the field also. Prevention targets people who are not diagnosed as having a substance use disorder. So we consider, if you look back or think back on the types of substance uses in a population, you can see that there are various stages of use and various stages of risk. So the prevention community has defined 3 types of interventions to address the needs of those different populations. This is this grouping may change over time. There's some of us who aren't so happy. It's like the DSM-5, everybody's happy with it, and it probably will change over time. But right now, this is what the field is advocating. There is a universal prevention interventions that target groups that have a mixture of non-users as well as users. Selective are those who are interventions that address vulnerable or populations that may be at risk. Probably the biggest group that would fall into that would be the children of substance users. And then there are the indicated prevention interventions that actually address individuals who may have initiated use but do not need treatment. So why doesn't everyone become a substance user? We don't have a great deal of research on this, and this would be for a young person who wants to make a name for themselves, this would be an area to explore. We know that vulnerability differs from person to person. It depends a lot on biological and environmental factors. And as we know currently in the last 10 years, it's 20 years by now, we know that the genetic factors are an important role in whether a person becomes a user or not. So that's important to know. This slide just is to emphasize the importance of looking at early interventions, because you can see the rapid progression from use to dependence for people who start at early ages. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about human development and vulnerability, because this is very important in prevention. Human development, we know that universally every stage of human development is associated with growth in intellectual language development, cognitive emotional skills, being able to do mathematical problems, and we're almost like clockwork. For those of you who have children, you can see that at certain ages something happens. They learn, they speak, they walk, early children think about concrete things, and then eventually they're able to begin to think more abstractly. So we're all of us develop in a sequential way. But any disruption of this growth process is going to make somebody vulnerable, not only to substance use problems, but their trajectory could be very negative in so many different ways. So prevention is very important. And early prevention, early intervention could prevent that trajectory from happening. The field is beginning to talk about prevention as a socialization process, because in many ways, what we're trying to do is to impact that process. And what is socialization? First of all, it says there, human infants are born without any culture. Socialization is actually acculturating human infants. We always talk about them as being us distant, but we are socialized when we're born. We're socialized across the lifespan by a number of different groups that influence what we do. They influence, our parents influence our attitudes, norms, beliefs, behaviors. When we go to school, school influences how it shapes some of these, either reinforce attitudes and norms that our parents deliver to us, or challenge them, or may give us a different way of looking at things. Our peers influence us. So this is a process that we go through even when we leave college or a university and go into our first job. That work setting is a different culture than our home setting or our school setting. So we're always exposed to these influences in our lifetime. And in prevention, what we do is try to look at that process, and we address it through behavioral interventions. In some places, people call those individual interventions, but I prefer behavioral interventions, and you'll see why later. And also environmental interventions. We'll talk a little bit more about that in this slide. This is a simplistic slide trying to depict what are the different influences on us. So think of your own family, for instance. So many of you may have siblings. The micro level environment, the first micro level environment we encounter when we were born are our families. And I know in my situation, I had an older brother, and my parents interacted differently with us. Because my brother had a different temperament than I had. He was obviously a little bit more difficult. I was just a great child. And my parents, I think, had a little bit more, he was more of a challenge to them. So they didn't know how to parent him as well as they parented me. But I think you can see that in your own family with your own children, for instance, also. So how we interact, how parents interact with us, affect how we behave, and that affects how we may interact with the rest of the world too. Think of the school as a micro environment also. When you go to school, the impact of the teacher and the school staff on how you behave, how you think about things, how much that influenced you in your careers. And then also think about your neighborhood where you grew up. That's the macro level environment and how that impacted you. So those different environments impact and influence how we think about the world, how we believe about what our belief systems are, what our attitudes are. And so that's very powerful, I think. So I mentioned these environments already: family, school, peer, and workplace. And also talked about the social environment and the physical environment. Think about growing up in Afghanistan at this time, what impact that has on children's behavior, and something we should be concerned about. These are the different roles that parents have. I'm not going to go into this because of time, but each of these micro level influences are very important for us. I'm skipping through this. Okay, so so we have that table of influences, and we have, in the course of the last 40 years, from those longitudinal studies that I mentioned earlier, when I was talking about the National Institute on Drug Abuse, we have a number of longitudinal studies that have gone on looking at children and adolescents and looking at the factors that seem to be related to whether they initiated use of substances or not. In fact, some of those studies, one in New York, Judy Brooke, is probably looking at grandchildren right now of the original population. So these populations, general population studies, and then of course there's studies of children of substance users where we learn more about what the etiology, what is the progression from whatever situation to substance use and then beyond. And from those studies that were done in the 70s and 80s, Hawkins and his colleagues at University of Washington published a paper in 1992 that summarized the correlates of initiating substance use, and that term risk factors was used at the time and still is, and those risk factors encompass contextual factors as well as individual and interpersonal factors. They also looked at what are the protective factors. That research wasn't as strong as the research for risk factors, but it did identify strong bonding with pro-social institutions like family and school, community and peers, and it has a lot to do with attitudes and behaviors. So risk and protective factors has been really had a real big impact on our field, and has been very useful. However, vulnerability goes a little bit deeper, because risk and protective factors that we have in place right now, as I said, are correlates of being associated with substance use, and they're indicators, but they're not necessarily really digging down to look at causation. So what we want to talk about is looking at this etiology model and recognizing that it is these social influences that really impact individual behavior. I want to just show you how that plays out in this slide. This is from research by Carl Hill, who at the time was at the University of Washington. Now, as a matter of fact, he's overseeing Blueprints, which is a registry of evidence-based prevention programs. In this slide, we're looking at children who have a behavioral disinhibition. So in the left side, we're looking at alcohol abuse by age 27. And these are looking at children who come from families where there's good family management, the blue line, and poor family management, the red line. And you can see that even though the children have the same vulnerability, having behavioral disinhibition, because they were in a family that managed that and was able to help that child relate to the world, their risk for abusing alcohol by age 27 was much lower, significantly lower than those that came from families that were not able to manage that child. And then in the other slide on the right is looking at alcohol dependence, and you can see that a similar trend occurs. If you're looking at that, so that's a behavioral intervention that would be used, focusing on family management. In this case, I'm showing an environment, and I'm sorry about the blurriness of it, but I think you can understand what we're showing here. We're looking at an environment influence, a macro environment influences, which is a regulation that increases the minimal legal drinking age. And we're looking at the impact of that regulation on alcohol-related motor vehicle fatalities. So you can see, Hope, on the left, this is before the enforcement of the new minimal legal drinking age. You can see the number of fatalities, the percentage, and then on the right you can see that it's dropped precipitously and very significantly after the enforcement. And I'm emphasizing the word enforcement because you can have a regulation out there on the books, but if you don't enforce it, you're not going to have this kind of an impact. This is really powerful. So what is the future for prevention? I think we're still embracing the risk factor approach for targeting prevention interventions. However, I think the vulnerability approach to prevention really addresses the kind of intervention or selection of intervention that addresses the actual mechanisms, the underlying mechanisms that are associated with these behaviors that we're concerned about. So evidence-based prevention interventions and policies target the individual directly with behavioral interventions, and also it directly and indirectly addresses them through targeting their micro and macro level environments, and those are called environmental interventions. So what do we do in our interventions? We either train our socialization agents, such as parents, by teaching them parenting skills, or teachers they're improving their classroom management skills, and improving their socialization skills. They're actually helping the children bond with the families in the classroom, and also to assume pro-social attitudes and pro-social behaviors. But we also have programs, behavioral interventions, that directly engage in the socialization process, and those primarily right now are manualized school-based curriculum. Okay, so the etiology model that I showed earlier is also effective in demonstrating where interventions can take place. And you can see that we can have interventions at all the different levels where the different arrows are. We can have interventions at the macro level that directly impact individuals, at the micro level directly impacting individuals, but we also have the macro, we can have macro level environments that impact macro level. So those are all the types of interventions that are available, and we do have evidence-based programs in most of those areas. So what are these? Oops, sorry. This is a cover of that International Standards on Drug Use Prevention. I'm not going to go into the intent, but basically, just a few words, is that we really try to pull together all the available scientific evidence about effective interventions, and we set up a number of rigorous criteria for what would be considered effective and high quality studies. By the way, the publication came out in 2013, but it was updated last year. And it's also available on the United Nations Office on Drug and Crime website. There's a definition of evidence-based. This comes out of the Evidence-Based Practice Institute in Washington, Washington. And it's a systematic way of just making decisions using available scientific evidence that show consistent positive outcomes, basically. This is a very complex chart, but it summarizes what is in that guide. And you can see across the top are the age groups from prenatal and infancy through to adulthood, and across the sides are the different settings, or if you want, the different micro and macro environments. And it shows the different types of approaches, strategies that can be used effectively. The color of the boxes, which is not very good on this slide, but the greenish colors are for universal prevention. The yellowish or goldish colors are for selective, and the red are for the indicated populations. And those that have multiple colors around them are effective for either universal, selective or indicated, as well as universal. The stars indicate the power or the quality of the strength of the assessments that we made, the strength of the evidence. So you can see that they range from 1 star for media campaigns and for mentoring, primarily because those are really difficult to evaluate. I don't think it has, they're really just hard. The research is hard to do. It's expensive and it's difficult, very challenging. In mentoring, we don't really have some good standard guidelines on what mentoring is or what the training should involve. All the way, so we have those 1 stars all the way to the 4 stars with parenting skills. That's very strong evidence, and the 5 stars for alcohol and tobacco policies. So one of the things that we're trying to do with the universal prevention curriculum is to really professionalize prevention internationally and to build capacity of those interested in prevention and those prevention professionals who are on the ground trying to deliver prevention interventions. We want to help them and feel, to make them more professional. And one of the things is just being able to, like for instance, having a definition of prevention. We need to speak the same language. And I think that's really important. Right now, I think we're coming closer to that than we have in the past. We need to have when you become a professional, there's a knowledge base you have to have, there's a set of competencies and skills, and then integrity and ethics, and I think those two are very much correlated. I think these are very essential components of a profession. Self-regulation is very important in the profession, and I'm hoping that ISUP will serve in that capacity, to begin to make sure that prevention is delivered ethically. One other thing that's important is how do you put it all together and to follow a procedure of putting, for implementing and delivering prevention interventions in a community. And this implementation cycle has been developed by the Europeans, and we've adopted it for our in our UPC in terms of professionalizing the field of prevention. Ethics is really important for so many ways, and we did a training last week in the state of Utah with some prevention coordinators, and I knew ethics is really powerful, but I really got to understand it better when we were talking about it last week, of how powerful it is for a profession to have a code of ethics. It defines the profession in many ways. It guides how we behave, and also when we're in situations, particularly in prevention as well as in treatment, but I think prevention is a little bit different in terms of where we go. When we do deliver prevention interventions, so much is focused on children, how important this is, having and being able to, when there's ambiguity in situations, how to make decisions, and having ethical guide out there really helps a lot in that process. And I think SAMHSA did a great job in putting this decision-making process together. And we teach that in our class. Here's a universal prevention curriculum, and what we were trying to do was adapting science to practice. And so what we cover is pharmacology of substances in the brain. We talk about prevention science, principles and theories. We summarize the literature. We talk about evidence-based prevention interventions and policy. There are certain cross-cutting themes that are addressed in UPC, and they towards the end of implementation of interventions in the community. So I'm coming to an end, so bear with me. We're talking about, these are the purposes of universal prevention curriculum. I think you may have heard this before, I'm not sure, but we certainly, there's a demand for evidence-based curriculum worldwide. And so one of the purposes is to in the prevention curriculum is to put forward that knowledge. We want to take, what the curriculum does is summarizes what's in the research literature. It's hard for all of us to keep up with the research literature. Certainly, practitioners don't read the literature as much as we researchers do. So how do we get that information and condense it in one place? That's one of the things we've been trying to do with the universal prevention curriculum. And the challenges, of course, is updating the curriculum. We wanted to ensure that, as I think I said earlier in the beginning, we wanted to look at that there's a consistency across region and across the world in terms of what information prevention professionals are receiving, and also we want to build an international capacity. It would be wonderful to go to meetings and speak the same language, and if somebody from if I went to Kenya, for instance, and I wanted to be a prevention professional, that my training would be accepted in Kenya as well as it was in the United States. So having that field professionalized around the world, I think, is really important. We developed 2 series. One series is for coordinators or decision makers. These are people who don't necessarily actually deliver the interventions, but who are supervising the delivery or planning the delivery. The reason why I wanted to do this one first was because after I was involved with the UNODC's development of the international standards and the seminars, and I kept thinking of the minister going home to their offices and turning around and talking to the person on their staff who was concerned with prevention, saying, "Oh, I went to this great seminar, and I've learned all this great stuff. So do you know about this?" And they were, they're going to stand there and say, "Well, yeah, somewhat, but not really." So the coordinator series is really targeting that population as well as prevention coordinators, like the people we trained last week in Utah, who actually supervise people who actually go into schools and into family service agencies, et cetera, doing prevention work. But we also wanted to address the implementers, those who actually deliver the interventions. And so we just completed the implementer series, and this is very skills-based and very intense program. So people who take this course, these sets of courses, will understand the prevention science and the foundation for evidence-based programs so that they deliver them with fidelity and sustain that fidelity over time. So those are 2 series. The key elements of the series are, as I said, the introduction to prevention science and its application, the physiology of pharmacology. We talk about the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime and the international standards. We also emphasize implementation cycles that I described earlier. The coordinator series, this is a summary of the courses in the coordinator series. As I said, this is more knowledge focused. It's very more academic than the implementer series. And it covers prevention science, physiology, and pharmacology. We talk about monitoring and evaluation because we feel that's really important, particularly monitoring. Then these become focused on family-based interventions, school-based, workplace, environmental, and these are laws as well as other kinds of interventions, but focused on policies, media, and on community-based implementation systems, which is how do you build systems in a community that would support integrated multiple interventions, like, for instance, school and family, or school, family, and workplace, as well as environmental interventions. How do you support that comprehensively? The implementer series replicates those different components, but they all have practica, and they're a little bit longer because of the practica. We have a week or so, a week of training, and then the participants go back to their work setting. They have a practicum that they have to complete, and then they go back to the class and they discuss their experience with the practicum. So the UPC helps prevention professionals speak with one voice. It supports comprehensive integrated evidence-based preventions and policies that are appropriate for their communities because they go through the implementation cycle. and helps plan that to the delivery of those interventions. So what is the role of university? I see the role of the university as training new prevention professionals, people who are coming through the degree programs, but also to reach out to professionals who are already in the field and to train them to become either, if they're not in the prevention field, to train them to become prevention professionals. We find that a lot of professionals, nurses, social workers, health educators, they're doing prevention, but they don't consider themselves prevention professionals, and they don't speak the language of prevention professionals. So we would like to reach out to them to help them identify themselves as prevention professionals and to join the field. We want to build the capacity of those who already define themselves as prevention professionals and to provide them with up-to-date information so that they improve the delivery of evidence-based interventions. We want them to recognize and advocate for prevention science. I think that's another role of the university, to say, yes, there is a science out there for prevention, and it's important to support that. And to work towards the goal of establishing comprehensive, integrated, continuous services in a community. I want to just give two examples of what's happening in terms of integrating UPC into university programs. I have an adjunct faculty position at Kent State University College of Public Health, and what we're doing there is we are offering an elective on community-based prevention, and then in Czech Republic, Charles University is put together a bachelor's, master's, and doctoral programs on addictionology that integrates treatment and prevention. Some of you may have heard Mikhail Miovsky talking about that program. Just briefly, we have a two-pronged approach that we're using at Kent State, where we have an online, we're pilot testing an online version of introduction to prevention of pharmacology. We actually pilot tested last year, or earlier this year, last year, I don't know what year we're in. And we had 25 students sign up for that course, and they wanted more. So we're putting together a second course looking at community-based prevention implementation systems, and we're going to be testing out this spring and the summer. And this is going to be offered to as an elective to the Master of Public Health students. We also are developing seminars for prevention professionals. We're doing that with Kent and with the State Department of Mental Hygiene that oversees prevention. We've just had seminars with them, and we're going to have an institute this summer with them also. Charles University, Mikhail did a fabulous job in doing content analysis and did comparative studies, and he was able to insert the UPC curriculum into his existing program, and as I said, he has degree programs in place. I won't go through all the slides because we're at 10 o'clock right now. So I think university-based curricula for prevention professionals offer opportunities for delivering online and in-class interventions to add or adapt UPC-related tracks to ongoing courses, or and I think if you have a program that reaches out into the community, it's another option, I think, for universities. So I think universities are great places to integrate the universal prevention curriculum. Here's my email address for those of you who afterwards have questions or want to get in touch with me for further information. Kim, I think we can open up to questions, or how do you want to?
If people can stay for a few minutes, or if you're willing to stay for a few minutes because it's late for you, I know. If people have questions, I have one question, so I'll launch the questions first. I know that a lot of the universities in ICDD are interested in adapting, whether it's the UPC or the UTC, to that academic environment, and so they've been sharing curricula. And I'm wondering if you have materials from your work at Kent State that you could or would be willing to share with universities if they're interested.
I think so. I mean, I have to go through. I think we would be able to do that. I've talked to the dean of the college, Sonia Delamagno, and you know, the university has some. You know, universities have their own what to say issues, but I certainly think we'd be able to do that. Absolutely. I'm hedging only because that's it right now. It's a joint effort, and I've got to talk to Sonia and get that straightened out. But we have talked about the possibility.
Did someone have a question? And you all are muted, so you have to go on to where your the microphone button and unmute yourself if you have a question.
Okay. Are you hear me?
Yes, now
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, Dr. No first.
Yeah, I just want to ask one question about, we are actually in an area like in Pakistan where evidence-based practices, particularly related with the preventions, they are quite scarce. Moreover, when we go to the, you know, as far as the university staff is concerned, the academia, they don't have any sort of training, particularly in the field of prevention. How to initiate it over there as far as we are concerned in the universities?
That's a really good question. Of course, we would love to come and help you. We don't personally have funds to do that. I don't know if funds, Kim, I don't know if funds are available for that kind of work. We actually had developed I had developed a plan to do this, actually what you're talking about, is to talk more about this through an online program, and then getting together for a 2 or 3 day meeting where we would talk about about how to do this, or talk about what possibilities there are, and then for whoever participates in that would go back to their universities and come up with a plan, and then we would get together again and sort of share those experiences, because I think we're going to learn. We can only learn from each other. I don't have, you know, I don't know. There's no answer out there, easy answer out there. Tim,
so I think that is what we're trying to create. And then the question is, how much of it has to be live and in person, and how much can we do through a medium like this? So think about this, and this maybe is something that I can talk to the board and some members about, is, you know, we could have a group that's interested in adopting a particular curricula or well, you know, like just let's say prevention. So you want to have a prevention program or even a prevention course. We could have a group of universities that are interested in that, working with a university that already has done that as a consultant, right? And so we could have calls like this initially and get people going, and then if there was something that required face-to-face, you know, that becomes more expensive, but there might be funds. There seems to always be funds somewhere. We just have to find them. So I would say that if it's electronic communication, anything that can be done that way is relatively easy to do, and we could and should do that if there's interest. And then it's just, you know, it's just people's time, basically. So we could set that up. So why don't we communicate via email afterwards, and we can talk about who would be the best people to work with you to help you set that up. And if there's enough interest, maybe we'll put a question out to the whole membership. If there's enough interest, we can get a implementation group together.
I see. Maybe what we can do is that, as you are saying, that we can have it through, these type of webinars and maybe the training like that. And later on, maybe we can have we can have a cost sharing initiative sort of thing or something like that, so that people can gather for 3 days from various universities who are interested. That's another way to do it. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's a good idea.
Yeah. Yes. For me, Prabhatan from Mahidol University, it is necessary for the lecturer in the university have credential and prevention side, or I don't know about the credential. Most of our lecturer finish from public health, but not have a credential in addiction professional. Is it necessary for teaching in UPC, or?
Are you I'm sorry, I didn't catch all of what you were saying. Are you talking about credentialing associated?
Yes, associated with prevention professional.
Well, first of all, there's the IC&RC. I don't know if you're familiar with that, the International Credentialing, and I don't remember all that what it stands for, but it's an internationally credentialing program. Prevention as well as treatments, substance use prevention and substance use treatment is encompassed under that. The Colombo plan is also starting an office for international credentialing. With tests, both of them require passing some tests.
Yes.
In prevention. I don't know if, and I know that different countries have different credentialing requirements. For instance, Czech Republic, Mikhail had been able to get the legislature in the Czech Republic to support a credentialing program for prevention for school teachers. So a school teacher could not do prevention unless they actually went through a course and passed a test to get a license. So I think it varies tremendously. Even in the United States, for instance, Utah, I just came from Utah, they have a different credentialing program than we have here in Ohio. So it varies. I think, we would like to make it standardized across the world if possible. I don't know, Kim, did you have any comments you wanted to add?
My only comment is I think that there are credentials that are available, and then it's a political process to make it to make the profession be something that is a credentialed profession. So that's one of those. Yeah. So, but you have good connections in your country, so that might be something you want to think about. Is in your long list of priorities, is that something you think would be both of value and possible to have Thailand have a process for credentialing for preventionists?
All right. I will. But for treatment, we adapt already. But for prevention, we didn't start. Right. Okay. I will. Thanks.
Were there any other questions?
Yeah. Hello. Good morning.
Christiana, go ahead.
Yes. I'm Christiana. I'm sorry for late into the meeting. I would like to ask the question. I think it's very important for us to do prevention in school. And is there any role model for prevention substance in school? I mean, it's very frequently in Indonesia to do prevention in school, but the program is just on and off. I think the program cannot maintain for a year, but it's just on and off. And I think, how do you empower, I would like to ask, how do you empower the prevention in school by university?
Empower you, that's a good question. If the international standards, what we found when we reviewed the literature about school-based prevention interventions, we found out that there's three ways you can introduce prevention in school. And it could be a gradual process. So the first thing is to look at substance use policies in schools. And I don't know if you have those in schools. University could help schools develop those policies effectively and enforce those. So I mean, that's one way universities can help, and that's something that may be enforceable over time. It's cost effective, and yet it has really good outcomes generally. The other is creating a positive environments for students in schools, and that goes a long way to not only reduce substance use, but also to increase academic performance. So it has multiple outcomes. And then school-based curriculum, and that's the real challenge, I think, is the school-based curriculum to maintain, as you point out, to maintain that over time. And I don't know what role your university could play in that. I don't know. One of the things that I'm hoping, maybe this is where the universities really have a major pull, is right now teachers are doing the interventions, and a lot of reasons why schools stop delivering these interventions, because the teacher's priority a teacher has is to teach. They have to teach children social studies, history, whatever it is that they're teaching. If we had a prevention professional, say in a community, who went to every school, who delivered a prevention, evidence-based prevention consistently over time, and isn't taking up the time of the teacher, that would be a very strong thing that a university can do, is to create that professional in the community. And we know that if you have a community that has substance use problems, and you have even if you just have a school-based curriculum that's delivered with fidelity year after year after year, you have a cumulative effect over time. You're eventually going to have all the children in the community will get older, and the next generation comes up. So you have multiple generations, multiple cohorts going through this prevention program. And then you really, I think, will impact the substance use, theoretically. So I think the university can have a role in creating that profession.
Zili, if I could interrupt, when we were in Kenya last month, this is the very issue that that some of the countries were struggling with treatment, as well as this sort of issue of how do you create a system, because it's not just educating people, right? If you educate preventionists and there's no profession, then they have no jobs to go to. And so there's this process the political process of creating a system of there being positions at the same time that you're creating a curriculum that trains the people that will take those positions. And so that's one tactic that is a long-term process of trying to develop this whole profession and the education system that trains the professionals. And then the other thing that people are doing, and so that's critical. And I think that there are lots of supports for countries to do that. And then the other, which we can help you connect with. And then the other thing that people are doing that I think is really interesting is they're infusing this knowledge, whether it's prevention or treatment, but prevention particularly, in the general education. So we had a great presentation from Kenyatta University in Nairobi, they were talking about taking the elements of the UPC or the UTC and identifying what made sense for for all of their students. And I think about that in the same way as what would make sense, because the reality is the teachers are the ones probably delivering, or the administrators are the ones delivering. So how do we make sure that what they're delivering is good and evidence-based, and they have the capacity to incorporate it throughout the school year, not just because we still have that in the United States too, where there's a one day that's the prevention day kind of a thing.
Yeah, crazy, right?
Yeah, thank you so much. And the second question is, how about the behavior addiction in the school? I mean, like internet addiction or gaming disorder. Have you done prevention about it?
I personally haven't, and there's more and more research in that area. When we were doing the review of the literature, it was a growing literature, but it hasn't really gotten to the point of evidence-based yet. I suspect that's something we keep our eye on for the next couple of years. Again, that research is difficult to do, but I'm optimistic that maybe in the next revision of the international standards, we'll have more of that. The other group that's been neglected, and I'm seeing some work in that area, and I think we're going to have some good stuff, is for the young adult population, the 18 to 25-year-olds, which in most countries is the highest risk group. You know, universities don't have a lot of evidence-based programs in place, but we're getting there.
Yes, thank you so much.
You're very welcome. It's good questions, all of them, and challenging.